Hey folks, with the charity stream finishing up this morning, I had a pretty busy week. So this week's video is purely an opinion piece versus a piece of analysis, as I didn't have as much time as usual to work on the video. Not that these aren't usually opinion-based, but this one a little more so than typical. We'll be back to the usual types of videos next week. I don't know if you've noticed, but Three Houses is a fairly controversial game in fandom spaces these days. Specifically, I see a lot of distaste for White Clouds, the first half of Three Houses that is pretty similar for all four routes, before they strongly diverge in the post-time skip part 2. I've always found this a little strange because White Clouds is my favorite part of Three Houses. I'm going to talk about some of the common critiques of White Clouds, which ones I agree with, why I don't agree with some of them, and what really makes White Clouds tick for me. But first, a big thank you to my patrons, Helix, Danny Doyle, Aihipu, Lucy Sev, Van West, Acrobatic Chaz, and a family of trees. I really appreciate your support. If you want to get early access to videos and shoutouts in videos and have access to polls that influence the content schedule, you'll find a link in the video description. Alright, so let's start off with what I like about White Clouds. I might use the terms Part 1 or Act 1 throughout this video, I just mean White Clouds when I do that. The best part about White Clouds is that it is the time where your units are at their most dynamic in Three Houses. During Part 1, your units are quickly leveling up their skills and going through a lot of classes, so your units change a lot as you unlock new combat arts and abilities. The result is that your characters can play pretty differently from chapter to chapter, and you're making a lot of decisions as you decide what class to go into next. This works for me on two levels. On a purely mechanical level, it's neat that your game plan can change from chapter to chapter depending on what units you decided to recruit, and how you decided to spend your instruction points. This also creates interesting decisions. You don't have enough teaching actions to instruct everyone at the start of the game, so who do you focus on? Do you rush getting Lysithea to warp, or maybe you work on her reason to get her to Dark Spikes in time for the Death Knight? Or maybe you don't have Lysithea, so you decide to work on Night Kneeler or Point Blank Volley for Leone. Maybe you're even thinking more long-term and you get cracking on Dimitri's Axe and Flying to get him access to a flying class later. Each playthrough, you get to decide what to prioritize in terms of teaching and unit recruitment, and it can heavily change what tools you have access to in the Act 1 chapters. This is also true in Act 2, but to a lesser extent. Your builds are closer to complete in Act 2, and there's not as much change from chapter to chapter. So while it's fun to see your builds pay off, I prefer Act 1 where things are changing more rapidly and you're making more decisions in between chapters. Beyond the chapter-to-chapter gameplay, I also think your units changing a lot in Act 1 perfectly fits the motif of the game. You're a professor, and you really feel like you're influencing your pupils as they unlock new skills with your tutelage and realize their budding talents. It's a great merging of the game's theme and narrative and gameplay. Additionally, the monastery just makes a bit more sense and is a bit better during Act 1. It doesn't feel as contrived that missions are a month apart, there's more characters around so the monastery feels more alive, there are more quests and character recruitment is on the table, so there's just more interesting things to do. I actually quite like the monastery during White Clouds, especially on your first couple playthroughs. The next thing that I like about White Clouds is that it's when the gameplay is at its strongest in Three Houses. Map design gets memed on a lot in Three Houses, and maybe rightly so, but a lot of the game's strongest maps appear during Act 1. The initial mock battle is a great introduction to the game. It keeps things simple by giving you just a handful of deployments, and you're introduced to a lot of characters in a way that feels pretty organic, such as Lauren's charging recklessly ahead into battle. The chapter plays on casual mode, which is great for introducing a new player to the series gently, and makes sense given what's going on in the story. And it's not a cakewalk on your first playthrough of Maddening. That's pretty good for a first map after the tutorial. Then later on, we get the first battle at Gronder Field, which is my pick for the best map in the game. You start in the center of two armies, and the enemies start to approach the middle fast. Once you deal with the initial rush of enemies that start closest to you, there's a couple ways to approach the map. You could charge into the middle and try to control the ballista in the center, both so you can use it to chip enemies, and so that you don't have to deal with enemies using it on you, or you could run off to one of the sides and deal with one army at a time. The second option seems particularly attractive at first because the two armies that aren't yours will fight each other in the middle. So you could go fight the enemies on the right side of the map while the enemies in the center kill each other. However, there's two catches. First, if enemies get enough kills, their entire army gets a buff, making them more difficult to fight. Second, you're promised a bonus reward if your army is the one to defeat the most enemies, so there's some incentive to get those kills for yourself instead of letting the other armies grab them. So there's a lot of moving parts that influence how you might play this chapter. You can let the enemy armies do the work, resulting in fewer but more powerful enemies for you to kill, but risking losing the bonus reward. Or you can rush into the middle of the map, getting lots of kills and EXP, but having to do more dangerous combat. Either way can bring you success, but the method that you choose is going to completely change the way that the map plays out. Another cool thing about this map is that it is influenced by what units you've recruited. If you've recruited a character that normally appears in one of the other armies, they're replaced with a generic with different stats. So not only do the decisions you make while playing the map matter, decisions you've made previously matter here too in a really tangible way. This map is also a bit of a difficulty spike and has some really tough enemies on it. It's a good test to see how good your decisions have been while raising your students, and narratively it's a fun chance to dunk on the other houses as well. I'm not going to go into detail on many other maps in part 1, but I like most of the maps in this act. I even like the beginning where your units are super weak and they have to team up to kill an enemy. Fire Emblem usually gives us units that are pretty dominant compared to the enemies, so it's a fun change of pace to instead have to figure out how to make do with these weaker units. It also fits the theme of the game again. These are students, not practiced soldiers. It really hits home when you hear their dialogue the first time they kill an enemy. For many of these characters, it's the first time they've ever killed someone. It makes sense that they're not battle-hardened and dominating enemies on their own yet. Units starting off this week also makes the payoff for their training arc even more rewarding when they get to be super strong later in the game. A common critique of early game in White Clouds, I think because of the weak units, is that it needs a Jagan, but I disagree. You have the entire second act, as well as the end of Act 1 to have super powerful units. The beginning of the game is about making do with your weak units and forging them into something powerful. A Jagan would make this portion of the game a lot less unique, and being able to roll over enemies with a pre-promote would make your early decisions feel less immediately impactful, since your units would just be catching up to a powerful unit you already have versus becoming uniquely powerful with each new ability and level up. So I kinda like that there's no Jagan. I think it makes the beginning of Three Houses play out differently than a lot of other Fire Emblem games in a way that I enjoy. Perhaps the most common critique of White Clouds is that it is too repetitive. You see pretty often things like, I want to play Three Houses again, but White Clouds ruins replayability, I don't want to play the same maps again. Now, I understand this criticism from people who got into the series with Three Houses, or who don't typically replay Fire Emblem games. But I've never understood this criticism in fandom spaces from people that replay other Fire Emblem games all the time. In most Fire Emblem games, almost every map is the same in a replay. A Three Houses replay on a different route is going to have more different maps than almost any game in the series. Plus, having different students to start with and different builds you can go after will make the early game a little different in each playthrough. So I get the perspective of the maps being too samey if you don't normally replay Fire Emblem games, because Three Houses is a game that encourages you to replay it more than most, with its 4 routes and different recruitable units. So I think if you don't generally find Fire Emblem games replayable, this is a fair critique, because Three Houses wants you to replay it, while most other Fire Emblem games give you a bit more of a complete experience in one playthrough. But I think if you buy into the inherent replayability of Fire Emblem, or replay other Fire Emblem games frequently, there's a lot to love about White Clouds. You make early decisions that will change how maps play out, and you most likely have a new set of units compared to your last playthrough. It's fresher than most Fire Emblem games on each replay. And then you get to Act 2 where you do get some unique maps to play. There is one criticism about replaying White Clouds that I do agree with, though I also think it applies to the entire game rather than just White Clouds, and it's that the monastery can kill motivation for a replay. I was pretty fond of the monastery on a first playthrough where it was fresh, but on a second playthrough where there's less new dialogue and quests are mostly repeats, it can become a slog. If the monastery is the thing holding you back from replaying Three Houses again though, I think there are a few things you can do to mitigate its issues. First, I notice people spend more time in the monastery than they need to. Often when people talk about the monastery taking too long, they mention lost items, gifts, and talking to everybody. You don't need to do all that. If you just want to get through the monastery and onto the tactics gameplay, you can just do meals, cooking, and maybe the occasional tournament. This will cut down on your time in the monastery massively compared to trying to do every little activity, and it's not going to affect your performance that much. If you really just hate the monastery though, and you want to minimize the amount of time you spend there, I highly recommend just using New Game Plus for replays. I don't see people talk about this much, but you can totally use New Game Plus to skip a lot of what you use the monastery for. Instead of grinding a unit's support or skills, just use New Game Plus and buy the skills you want for the unit. You're in complete control over what skills you buy and when you buy them, so you don't have to become overpowered either. You can just buy the skills that you would have gotten from the monastery, but without doing the monastery. The only downside to this method is that it can require a couple playthroughs to get all of the New Game Plus unlocks that you would like to have. Also, you can't do this on a first playthrough, but I like the monastery on the first playthrough, so that's not as big of a deal to me. Basically, I do think it would be nice if there were a better way to speed up the monastery segments on replay, and monastery burnout is very real. But I do think there's some mitigating steps one can take to make it a bit better. Getting back to focusing on White Cloud specifically though, I also think the monastery is at its best during this part. The choices you make in the monastery are their most impactful here, and you don't start out with maxed out professor level, so you'll be spending less time here simply due to lack of actions compared to later in the game. So during White Clouds, the monastery is more interesting, better tied to the story, and even quicker, particularly in the early game compared to later in the game, so I don't mind it as much here. All in all, I really like White Clouds. I love building up my units and seeing them change from chapter to chapter, and I think it makes the gameplay a little more dynamic than Part 2, where your powerful builds start to come online and chapters can begin to play out in a very similar way, as you can start to abuse things like Warp, Stride, and Vantage Wrath. And there are just fewer decision points between chapters in Part 2, because it takes longer to raise your abilities those last few ranks, it takes longer to master the classes, there's not as many class changes you're trying to make at this point, there's just not as many decisions you have to make. Part 1 is a playground, everyone's reclassing all the time, new abilities are unlocking, and you get to play my favorite maps in the game. I also think it's incredibly good on a first playthrough where the monastery is totally fresh and all the dialogue is new. Anyways, none of this is to invalidate anyone that doesn't like White Clouds or Three Houses, but I think a lot of the specific criticisms of White Cloud are a little unfair. Some criticisms, like the monastery being a slog, not only apply to the entire game, but are even at their least problematic during White Clouds. While others, like the game not offering enough new material per playthrough to justify a replay, feels a little weird when White Clouds offers more fresh material than almost every game in the series in the form of new units and different build options, especially when this critique is made in a fandom where we often replay games where every map is the same and there's no difference between the units from playthrough to playthrough, beyond the differences created by growth RNG and different levels of investment, which exist in every Fire Emblem game. For this reason, I actually find White Clouds to be one of the more replayable portions of Fire Emblem games, minus the monastery if you really don't like the monastery. So that's my defense of White Clouds. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked it, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload, or check out the community Discord that you'll find linked in the description. Either way, thanks for hanging out and have yourself an awesome week.